Welcome to Why We Collect,
a podcast by Bright Archives.
I'm Catherine Barbera.
And I'm Dave Bernabo.
In anthropology, in archeology, in archives, I think recognizing that interplay, that interaction between the objects and the people and the stories and the power structures and the cultural fabric is at the heart of making meaning and making meaningful archives.
Today we're talking with Lauren Herckis.
I'm Dr. Lauren Herckis. I'm an anthropologist, and I study the ways that people use technology and how technology shapes culture and culture shapes technology. I'm particularly interested in the ways that culture changes over time and technologies and the way we use technologies change over time.
So I'm really excited about today's conversation. Lauren and I worked together for a couple of years there, starting in about 2020 to about 2022, where we were looking at the history of robotics and how do you preserve archives and materials coming out of robotics labs. And one of the concepts that came out of that research was this idea of meaningful archives. And how do you create an archive that feels relevant to modern audiences, that feels significant to modern audiences? And so I'm excited to revisit that.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. And as someone who collects a lot of things, I'm excited to hear more about the history of why people collect things and why people study the things that people collect.
No, absolutely. She's really knowledgeable about material culture, digital preservation. So how do you preserve all the digital files on your computer? Just topics like that. So Lauren was one of the first anthropologists that I ever really worked with. And there are some interesting similarities between archives and anthropology, but they are two very different lenses to look at the history of humans. And so I'm excited to dig into that a little bit today.
Awesome. Well, let's get started.
There is a joke, an archaeological joke, that when you find an object and you don't know what it is, but it's clearly something. People made this and they put this here for a reason. Well, it must be a ritual object. I mean, maybe it was a toothbrush. Maybe the person who used it regularly used it for a mundane, everyday kind of experience, and they didn't put a lot of value on it, but that same object was part of someone's everyday life and could be on a pedestal in a museum as this is my connection to that person who lived 20,000 years ago or in this strange and exotic place. And, so many museums were, and this is much less common now, almost, shrines to objects as a bridge between the person looking into the glass case and the person who lived in this place in this time far away. Even if the meaning that those two individuals inscribe in that object is wholly different, completely different, there's still an interaction through that object, through space and time, right? It's a different story. But in terms of making shared meaning, that definitely takes interaction that is shared and intentional in a different kind of way. So I think it can be both.
Interesting. So like a toothbrush I'm using that I used this morning to brush my teeth. Like in 500 years, it might be sitting in a glass case in a museum somewhere. People are going, wow, what is this object?
There's a fabulous it's a graphic novel. It's a highly illustrated book called Motel of Mysteries. I can't remember the author's name, but it portrays the person who discovered King Tut's tomb, except it's a motel that was covered by a landslide, and in hundreds and thousands of years in the future, discovering the toilet seat. This must be a ritual necklace, and here it's a motel that we would recognize as a motel and everything in it, but being encountered in the way that we portray someone entering King Tut's tomb is the classic example of, wouldn't that be a neat archaeological adventure to explore this chamber that hasn't been entered in however many thousands of years. At one point, that was a, highly restricted and specialized and valued space, but a very typical of a time and place space that would be recognizable and not particularly mysterious to the people who we're creating and using it. And that's true about a toothbrush as well, right? There is a difference between the artifacts in the White House and the artifacts in my house in terms of status and value and cultural cachet. But, we inscribe that difference in terms of social import. And one way that we value things as valuable things is because they're old or they're rare or they're from far away, or they make that connection to my great-great-grandmother or, the people who were here before, or a place that I will never have an opportunity to go.
On the one hand, the original context of that object does matter because it helps us understand the people who created it and used it and chose to preserve it or
discarded it.
Or discarded it. On the other hand, if we misunderstand the original meaning of that object, it doesn't necessarily matter because we're still able to have that connection with it.
I mean, it may matter to different people in different ways, right? So if the archaeologist's goal is to use a collection that's encountered in context to better understand the lived realities of people who they can't ask, because those people lived hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, then trying to use that material culture, that collection in context, to try and understand what is the daily life like for these people, then you take one set of well-developed methods in order to explore and understand that collection. If my goal in opening the box that I opened this past weekend that has mementos for my family, a tablecloth that was embroidered by a great-great-aunt, and to have some sense of connection to family and continuity and heritage, then that's a different kind of use for those materials. That's a different meaning that I'm inscribing. It's a different story that I'm interested in telling. And I actually have no idea if my great-great-grandmother made many of these tablecloths and would have looked at this one as not her best work, and I don't want my children and my children's children to have this terrible piece of work, or if this was a prized possession that was a one-of-a-kind kind of... I have no idea, but I do know it's the only thing I have that she made, and so it has that meaning for me. And I think both matter, and I'd love to know whether she would consider this a prized possession or not. It still has value for me, but having more of the story would also be interesting and useful for me.
So you've used this phrase material culture a couple of times. Can you give us a definition?
No. So if culture is all of the shared, learned, patterned behavior, symbolic behavior that represents the unique nature of a particular social group, then material culture would be all of the materials that are part of and produced by that culture. But the phrase material culture is used all kinds of different ways by scholars in all kinds of different fields and in different contexts. And culture is really hard to pin down. Culture is shared, patterned behaviors. It's almost overwhelmingly symbolic, but it's also always contested. In any social group, there are people who say, this is our cultural heritage, and there are people who say, that's not my cultural heritage, even though they're part of the same cultural system. There are diverse perspectives on what's normative and what's changing and what's conservative and what's continuing and what was and is no longer. It's dynamic. It's always changing. And the same is true for stuff. There are necessarily material components of culture and material products of cultural practices and processes, but the meanings and the uses might differ even within that cultural group, and certainly over time.
So I've been doing a little bit of reading on material culture recently, and I encountered this anthropologist. I think he's based in London. His name is Daniel Miller. He wrote a book called Stuff that I thoroughly enjoyed. I recommend checking it out if you feel like doing some material culture reading. One of the things he does in this book is he unpacks this idea that the stuff we keep is superficial, right? It only tells you so much about a person. It doesn't get at the heart of an individual. And by the end of the book, I was really questioning the assumptions I make about stuff as superficial. And then I started to think, well, as I was reading the book, are archives superficial? Because it's all just stuff that people created. It doesn't get at the heart and soul of an individual. Oh no, is my career choice superficial? It's like having an identity crisis as I'm reading this book. But by the end, he kind of leaves you with this idea that we create things, but objects also create us. So the materials and objects you choose to take into your life and the materials and objects you choose to identify with throughout your life create your identity. They create the meaning you keep about yourself. They create the idea you have about your community and your culture. And it took on this depth and this breadth that I didn't realize. So like the blue jeans I chose to wear yesterday say more about me than the color of my hair, which I had no choice in whatsoever when I was born, right? It's a fascinating idea. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, as this idea of objects as being superficial and how we might question that a little bit, and how much material can tell us about individuals.
Yes, a wonderful book, a wonderful set of perspectives. And I find it really interesting that when you say superficial, it sounds like you're saying only or just superficial. That superficial is somehow not good, that it means less. Even as you're also saying that it could mean more. And so I would offer another book to complement that perspective, which is by a well-known anthropologist and archaeologist named Ian Hodder. It's called Entangled, an archaeology of the relationships between humans and things. Part of being human is the enduring and constant negotiation of interacting with and maintaining and reconsidering and rejecting or adopting the stuff in our lives. And that process is part of how we know who we are and we understand our relationships with others and the world around us. It's part of, as we were saying earlier, part of making meaning. There's this inescapable, persistent process of being with and making choices about whether it's a choice to wear these blue jeans or to purge my closet and get rid of all of those clothes that I just don't want to be part of my style any longer, that we're in constant negotiation with our stuff. That can be a positive and proactive exercise of agency. It's me making a choice about how I want to be, or it can be reactive, or it can be a signal of where I am in that moment of time, or what my priorities are, or how I don't get to exercise my priorities, the structural context within which I'm operating. So it's surprising to me to hear superficial as just. I think that for a lot of people, material culture, the objects that they have and interact with or don't have or aspire to or reject are as much a part of who they are as the color of their hair.
It brings me to start to think about, collections and archives and the things we bring into our lives. The word value comes to mind. Archivists, we have specific value that we assign to historical objects. It's usually like informational, right? It tells you something about a specific time and place. Evidential, it provides evidence of something that happens. Historical, intrinsic value, so it has value because it was owned by a specific person that, has a certain status in our culture and in our society. So it has value, George Washington slept here kind of thing. So I'm wondering, from an anthropology perspective, thinking about evidential, historical, intrinsic value, are there other perspectives that you would bring to that too from an anthropology perspective?
Like other academic disciplines, anthropologists have developed more frameworks than I could count to understand things or people or contexts, and how we construe value is something that anthropologists and archaeologists think about a lot, and sometimes in lots of different ways. It's hard because the way you describe that framework, there are direct correlates in anthropology, but not all anthropologists would agree with them, and not all anthropologists would use them, and some would. I think that when things have cultural value, when things have value within a particular cultural context, sometimes it's because they're rare. Sometimes it's because they're evidentiary or informational. Sometimes it's because they symbolize or embed wealth or coercive power, or because they reinforce a preferred narrative, a historical narrative maybe, or a narrative about differences among groups, or about the sameness of people, regardless of whether they are affiliated with various groups, because they advance some narrative that people are invested in. Maybe not everyone, but at least some people, some segment of society. Ultimately, the value of things is pretty arbitrary in a vacuum. It is only meaningful in context. So cacao beans might be the most valuable thing because they're currency, because they're used for trade, because they signify wealth. Or they might just be interesting and trash because they don't where you are. Gold might be rare and hard to come by and used as currency and signify wealth and value. Or it might just be, too soft a metal to use for anything. It depends on where you are and who you are and whether people agree with you. Because if one person says, this thing in my hand, this signifies wealth and value, and I will trade it with you, these 3 magic beans, and the other person says there's no such thing as magic beans and I don't want that, then it's not a shared meaning, and so it's not true, right? So for something to be valued, people have to agree that it is of value. So a lot of museums, a lot of private collections, there are different motivations for creating them, but often it's a symbol of wealth and power that can be exercised socially in lots of different ways. So if you want to get really functional about it, a lot of museums, a lot of private collectors, a lot of organizations that have spaces filled with valuable artifacts have them because it is a symbol of and a way to visibly demonstrate power.
That is one of the reasons organizations create archives, is to reinforce reputation, to reinforce narratives about that organization, to reinforce the power and influence of that organization. Demonstrate impact is a phrase used a lot. Impact of whatever the mission is of that organization or the people within it. Demonstrate growth over time. It's a role that personally I've always been a little uncomfortable with, right? Being part of that power structure. But it sounds like from the definition you gave that's innate to the collecting process. There's a power structure at play. So maybe the more important part of it is just being aware.
There are power structures at play in human groups, like full stop. And material culture reflects those power structures and reinforces or contests those power structures. We create valuable objects in order to use that power or display that power. So a cut emerald on display symbolizes wealth, as currency leverages that wealth. Objects can have value that's utilitarian, so the very functional tools, and they can have symbolic value that communicates cultural affiliation or status as part of a group. There are objects that signify I am a firefighter, I am a queen, I am a married person. There are objects that communicate to others status, and there are objects that communicate to others power. And there are objects that reinforce narratives. So the inscription on the side of the monument, the crest that communicates membership in an elite class or an elite institution. And of course, there are lots of objects that are both utilitarian and have a lot of symbolic power. And this is part of where we can get into like conspicuous consumption and some of the ideas about style as superficial or style as communicative, style as agency and power, or style as frivolous or a waste of time. All of those narratives are valid. They're all useful for different people in different moments, and depending on the positions of the people involved, are really vitally important communication and interaction to have with the people around you, or are a frivolous waste of time. Depends on the power structure of the people involved. Thinking about the ways that material culture can reflect or reify or contest power structures in communities, in cultural context, is also a good way to remember that we create the meaning, right? The crown jewels have one meaning during a coronation and a different meaning when they're on display and being circulated among populations that might say, hey, those aren't yours, those are ours. The same object can be received very differently and can have different impact and different meaning because there's a mutual understanding of meaning and power differences.
So this conversation has me thinking about like timescales, right? We've been talking about objects that are 5 years old, 100 years old, hundreds of years old. And I'm starting to think about digital objects and digital files and how, one day to the next, a digital file can change drastically in terms of meaning. Lifespans suddenly become much shorter. Things get much more complicated. And I don't really have a question or an answer here, just more of a scream into the void. Like, what do we do, right?
Yeah.
How do we keep a handle on the meaning that we are assigning and understanding when it comes to digital objects, digital files, because it changes so rapidly.
And part of what changes is the utility. As the technological infrastructure changes, that same file that you saved, that digital artifact that you saved, may no longer be accessible, may no longer be what it was. Things don't have use outside of their context, except as different use in a different context. Digital artifacts are things in that people use them and they have meaning and value, but like other things, only have meaning within context and only have utility that people can leverage if they have the power and the tools to make use of those objects, those digital objects. Because digital infrastructure is so complex, the power goes out. We switch from some kind of storage technology to another. Those floppy disks aren't useful anymore unless you can read them. The infrastructure is so complex that lots of different pieces of it could change and render previously useful objects or previously valuable digital objects useless or valueless except as an artifact. And I think part of the challenge is that, like we said earlier, it's very human to think of things as fixed and unchanging. But you look away for a minute and it's changed. That makes maintenance much more intensive and much more important. And so people have to make decisions. Is this important enough to transfer to a different kind of storage device, to maintain and update, to be able to continue accessing it? Where do we invest our energy? And where do we recognize that if we don't invest energy, it's lost? Yeah, it's really different than almost any cultural object, almost any material culture that humans have been using for hundreds and thousands of years, because stone and wood and bone and paper, they last in the soil, on the surface. Some remnants of those are preserved that we can read into to learn about activities and people of the past. Digital worlds exist right now that will be lost. They will be lost. There will be no recovering that unless people have documented them elsewhere. And people have relied for most of the history of people on oral history. As long as people have been around, oral history has been an incredibly important way to preserve and share ideas, including ideas about material. And that's what we'll have from the digital worlds, but that's what we'll have.
It makes me worried about kind of this uprise in misinformation and how that would impact oral history. My friend John Miller and I did a film about Moundsville, West Virginia. And while the final cut did not include anything with Trump, we did ask questions, and they were all kind of like Fox News talking points. So it wasn't original ideas. It was things that became embedded in a person as their own thoughts. And then those came out in the oral tradition.
As a species, we rely on the people around us to help us make meaning. This is the nature of the co-creation of culture, and it's dynamic and constantly changing. And so when the people around us are making observations or telling stories, those are the stories that we take in. Those are the lens through which we see the world. So oral history is incredibly powerful. There are song lines that describe landscapes that help people navigate what's now Australia and have been helping them navigate what's now Australia for thousands of years. Those song lines have been maintained and describe landscapes that in some cases have been under the ocean for hundreds of years or even thousands of years, but the landscape, just the map, is consistent. People rely on stories. And there are stories that change like a game of telephone regularly. The way that we value those stories shapes the way we understand the world that we live in. That's how we co-create meaning. So we're living in a moment where we have access to, or where we're bombarded by, all kinds of stories. And when we hear a story a lot, it shapes our understanding of the world. So I do worry a lot about persistent stories being shared that represent a distorted lens, a particular worldview that devalues people or groups as opposed to kind of promoting equitable perspectives on different groups of people. I worry a lot about that, but I also don't know what to do about that.
Are you on Camp Digital Dark Age, or do you have a little more hope than that?
I definitely have lots of hope. I think that when folks are thinking about preservation, things are preserved. I think to imagine that we've been more generative in the last 5 years than a group of people might have been, 500 years ago, is prioritizing certain kinds of generation. We don't have everything. We don't have a complete archive of anyone's life. We'll have what we have and what we seek to preserve, and we'll keep and create stories from whatever people have maintained and what we prioritize in the future. What you said a moment ago made me think of the work that we did together to preserve a lab, which is a socio-technical object. It's the people, the activities, the tools, the things that they learned, the questions that they asked. And we really struggled to figure out, how do you collect that? How do you preserve that? How do you represent that in a way that's meaningful? And one thing that we talked about a lot was the meaning was different for different people, and different people were represented in different ways. From a distance, the people with the most social or financial or institutional power were the ones who were most represented. But when we got into the labs, started talking about, well, who does the work? Who asks the questions? Who knows? Who maintains? Who records? Who advances? A lot of the individuals weren't well represented. A lot of the stories were really hard to find, in part because they weren't even the stories told within that cohort of people. And the folks without the power, without the institutional power, without the power to promote their narratives, were often at the center and the heart of the functioning of these organizations, these groups. And so I think exploring the context, the power structures, the practices, the values in their diversity, recognizing that there are the people with more power or less power or different kinds of power, and they're all part of a system. That whole complex cultural context, including the material culture, but also the stories that people value and the stories that people don't value. They make something unique and beautiful as a whole. And paying attention to all of the pieces of it is only possible when we think about the meaning, not just superficial choices, the choices that shape and create that dynamism and change. In anthropology, in archaeology, in archives, I think recognizing that interplay, that interaction between the objects and the people and the stories and the power structures and the cultural fabric is at the heart of making meaning and making meaningful archives and creating compelling narratives and constructing self. Who am I and what does this object mean to me and why am I keeping it? Why did I keep this again? Because it was important. It was important to me for these reasons in relation to these experiences and these other people.
I think that was one of the best definitions of why we collect things. So thank you so much, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Now I know why I'm like this.
Thanks for listening to Why We Collect. This episode was produced by Catherine
And Dave. And Dave made all the music and sound design.
If you want to learn more about Lauren and her work, we put a link to her website in the show notes.
See you next time.